Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. Big one this time around, big post. I am going to introduce you to an album that I've really fallen in love with this year called A Tale from the Other Side by Timmy Sean. This is a self-proclaimed power pop rock opera, or popera as he likes to call it, and it tells the tale of a guy named Guy Scorpio who finds his life sort of derailed by this rampaging monster that goes across the nation, terrorizing the countryside. And what makes this album particularly interesting is that it's a commentary on the events of 2020, told through various horror movie tropes and with musical cues from throughout power pop history. And due to the magic of the internet, I was actually able to get a hold of Timmy Sean and talk to him a little bit about the inspirations behind this album, his influences, the writing and the recording processes that went into it. So without any further ado, I'd like to present Timmy Sean. So, Timmy Sean, it is extremely great to meet you.
Hey, man. It's great to meet you, too.
First of all, I love the album. I love the album.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
I feel like I'm that kid whenever I was in high school, I would walk around with a pair of headphones and be like, gotta check this out, man. You know, like the 21st century version of that right now. Of course, the idea of the power pop rock opera, I think, is a brilliant idea. Okay? It takes my two favorite things. I'm kind of a prog rock nut, and I'm a power pop nut. Like I'm the guy who likes like Rush and Jellyfish are like my bread and butter, you know. And to have somebody kind of tackle that and put it together in a way that was compelling was great. And I was immediately drawn to that idea. And then I started thinking about and noticing that you had said that it was kind of it's inspired by the events of 2020. I think you said as a fictional allegory. Inspired by the events of 2020.
Exactly. Yeah, I didn't really... I found it compelling to write. I mean, everything that I was writing was the stuff we were living through. It was hard to write about anything else last year. But I was like, it's a sensitive subject. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying. So I'm like, I can't really write about this literally. But there's got to be a way in. So as I was writing about it, I'm like, I kept describing 2020. I'm like, it feels like we're living through a horror story. Like, it feels like we're living through a horror movie. I'm like, what if I kind of use that as my in? All right, just try to think of it. All right, it's not COVID. It's a monster that's attacking. And then I started, okay, all right, she's a monster. And that song kind of came out. And once I had that song, that kind of cracked it for me. And then I started breaking down, okay, if I have this coming in, and then I was starting writing, all right, with the spring breakers that are going to the beach last year in the middle of the pandemic, and I was like, all right, and I had this show on the road, which is a song on the album, and I kind of wrote it from that perspective, and it was like, all right, if there was a monster attack, and you had these people that I've been inside for 3 weeks, and I can't take it anymore, I'm going out, and I was like, all right, I wrote Show on the Road, and then it just kind of worked from there, and then I had some songs that were sitting around, and I pulled in from, okay, that could kind of be the beginning of a story. I had the song The College Year, and that was like, all right, that and Fortune and Fame kind of back to back in California. I had these three songs that seems like the beginning of a story, and that kind of kicked off the whole, all right, I think I could weave this into a whole rock opera.
Maybe you should finish up once you started, but I had plans that I wouldn't break. By the time of July, all the dreaming was over. Oh no, someone's here. We'll always have to come.
That's from Dusk Till Dawn thing that kind of goes on with it. And so like the first half is like, okay, cool, right? And then, you know, it happens and there's the skit with the monster, and then
that's it. It was. I have a list of influences that I just kind of was jotting down as I was doing the whole album, and a lot of them were movies. Like, I mean, there were definitely albums and things that I pulled from, but that kind of just comes as I'm doing the music. But like, when I was kind of coming up with a list of, as I was writing the lyrics, which kind of comes last for me, I Dust Till Dawn was right at the top of the list. Like Tarantino, Dust Till Dawn, like something that kind of just takes a turn, exactly like you said. I like the idea of that moment in the album, and then just kind of I wanted to escalate. I wanted to kind of build and build and build and get. And I ended up writing "Come Back Alive" was like the last full song that I wrote, and I'm like, it just should build to like more and more of a rock thing, and by the end of it, it should be. And I'm a big Kiss fan, and I'm like, I should be like there's an outro to Shock Me. I don't know if you're a Kiss fan at all, but anyway, but there's like a big guitar solo part at the end of it, and I'm like, I want it to build up to like a big rocking riff guitar thing. I'm like, which is definitely different than the way the album started, but I'm like, there isn't really a spot on the album where it just does a big rock guitar thing.
When you put yourself in this sort of stipulation of making a power pop rock opera, you kind of hem yourself into like a certain, the 3.5 minute format, right? Which I think you do brilliantly, by the way. Like, each of those songs is generally like a freestanding song. Towards the end, it changes a little bit, right? But certainly it starts out with like, this is a 3-minute song that stands alone on its own, but it definitely has a thread that goes through it. And I think as you go through it, I perceive that the style changes. It's kind of what you're talking about. So at the beginning, like, I really hear like, this is kind of like the Badfinger song. This is kind of like the song where it sounds kind of like Oasis. You're like picking from different points in power pop history, it sounds like to me, that allow you to give it that some breadth of some variety, but still stick within the tradition.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's funny. The original idea that I had for an album was basically just like a love letter to all the music that I grew up with, and it was like Oasis, and for me it was like the late 90s, early 2000s, but like Ben Folds 5 and Phantom Planet, I think I'm wearing that shirt. Yeah, Phantom Planet, and like all these bands that were kind of the later generation, Fountains of Wayne, and it kind of started off as like, oh, I'm just gonna write like Weezer was a big one, and maybe I'll just do like a 10-12 song power pop album, and that's In California was kind of the first song that I was like, all right, let me jump off of that. And I released that as a single.
I was lonely, feeling awful, hitting too hard on the bottle. I was a shell of what you'd call a broken man. All of the magazines say there's a place that is magical, where all your dreams will be made. You can have it all in California. Everyone's in California.
As I started having songs and songs pile up, and then I started writing during the pandemic last year, it just kind of took on a life of its own. And then I was like, all right, let me rethink this whole album. So it was nice that I started off with standalone song ideas, I think, which I think as opposed to like, oh, let me write a song about 2020, or let me write an album about 2020. I feel like it might have been harder to come up with 3.5 minute pop songs as we were going through that last year. But
Sure. And the second half of the album, after you take the turn, after you drive into the vampire club, it feels like it starts to almost like collapse. The styles kind of collapse a little bit. And you talk about Weezer as an influence. I hear that really strongly on that. I often tell people as I'm listening to this, like, it feels like Weezer meets Queen. It's got that big theatrical side to it. I hear the Brian May, where I mentioned that once, your really like bombastic melodic guitar playing harkens to that, but still has that kiss by way of Weezer.
As a guitar player, Brian May is a huge influence, and then just as a songwriter, Rivers is a huge influence. So I mean, that's a pretty good description of some of my biggest influences right there.
And especially towards the end, I feel that really strongly.
The whole time, all the red in my eyes was control. control in my mind. I was on the wrong side. Now I fight to survive in this place. I've arrived, but please know I will try to come back to you. I'll return to you from the other side.
And I also think it's pretty cool towards the end. You stray from the Power Pop program a little bit by putting a little more like the intros and vignettes in there. And which in me, like that also kind of harkens back to almost like second side of Abbey Road. You know, where you get into like, okay, all these little things aren't really songs. They start with like a prog thing, where it's like a multi-movement big piece. But each of those little bitty chunks fits together into a bigger picture, which I think is pretty clever too.
Thanks. I mean, yeah. I mean, above everything else is the Beatles for me. I mean, it's you know, it's the book. It's the open up the book and how you're gonna write a song. But my father and uncles had a Beatles tribute band, so like I grew up. I mean, there wasn't a time where I wasn't familiar with the entire Beatles catalog. So just like by the time I think I played in first grade, I played Twist and Shout on drums in the elementary school talent show. So it was like from the time I was 4, I was drumming along with Beatles songs. But yeah, the Beatles, pretty much Beatles, Weezer, Queen are like the top 3, 4, 5 acts, you know, in that list for me. So
the production quality, I think, of the album is really pretty amazing. So
thank you.
Is that you did that all at your house?
There's about 3 or 4 songs maybe on the album that I cut drums at a studio before the pandemic hit. Everything else was recorded basically in the room I'm sitting in right now. So I had cut a handful of songs that I had demos for ahead of time. I had gone into a studio and knocked out a bunch of drum tracks, and I ended up using about 3 or 4 of those songs. But everything else was cut here. And I had, we were living in an apartment about 6 months before the pandemic hit, and we decided, I was looking at renting a studio and keeping the apartment, and then we were like, you know what, we moved on the other side of LA, we could probably rent a house and find a place where I could kind of set up shop in the house. So really fortunately, I was just about done setting up the studio in like February, right before everything hit, and I had kind of figured out, all right, I can find a way to track some drums in the house, I can find a way to cut everything, and the next thing we knew, we were in the place for the next year. So it was like, well, that worked out.
One of my favorite songs of the album, this is one I really knew you meant business, is when I got to Fire in the Pouring Rain. And that song, like, I was listening to it for the first time. Sometimes I listen to music as I'm going to bed, and I was like, man, that's some heavy stuff going on in that song. And I envisioned, like, this, like, arena-level Pink Floyd show with, like, screens and stuff, you know, and it's a shame that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore, but it feels like that's the kind of theatrical thing that could happen with this particular album.
I saw you posted something on Instagram of the, Scenes from Memory, the Dream Theater album. And that actually was kind of like the first big rock prog thing. I had a buddy that was like totally into them, and he brought me to see them, and he was a couple years older than me, and he brought me in, I guess, it came out like 99, something like that. And that was like the first show. And that album was actually an influence. There's like some things on this album that I pulled in from there, like even the
TikTok at the beginning, dude.
Yeah, that was definitely an influence on this album for sure. And it was like, as far as crafting the story and being like, all right, leaving it ambiguous enough. Like, I like the idea of that, where it's like, okay, there's enough things in here. I've done a couple of interviews now, and a couple of the interviews, I think they have their whole different take on it, and I'm like, but that's cool. I like that. Like, I want people to I have in my head like a story, and I kind of script it out and at some point I had an idea of maybe doing like some kind of animation or something to it, but just to have people have their own different take of it is cool too.
Yeah, I purposefully not asked you about what things mean, to be honest, because I really love the way that it is ambiguous, that it can be multiply interpreted, you know, and sure, if you know what happened in 2020, unless you're like under some rock or something and didn't know about it, you wouldn't necessarily know that was what it was about. But like Fire in the Pouring Rain, like all the call signs are in there. You talk about, 100,000 people gone and stuff like that, and it's like, it just rings.
100,000 lives on the news today. Who's to blame? You and I inside will hide away until it's safe. Life can never be anything like it was before. They just make believe till the flames grow too high to ignore. Fire in the pouring rain.
There's just a little something about that song. So the first verse of that song I wrote without hopefully ruining the song. No, but the first verse of that song I wrote in what year was it? It was 2017, I think, the end of 2017. And back to back, there was the shooting in Las Vegas, where there was like the mass shooting, and the next night Tom Petty died, or vice versa. I think it was the next night Tom Petty died, and I wrote that whole first verse, and I had like the melody for that, and it just sat because I didn't know where to take it from there, and I'm like, I don't have another verse for this, and it sat around, and then when everything happened last year, I was like, oh, I have a second verse like this, and I just started writing, and I kind of finished up the rest of the song last year, but it sat around for like 3 years because I was like, well, this is really like a sad song, like, but I don't want to just do like filler lyrics for another verse. I just didn't have anything that vibed. I remember hearing Warmth of the Sun, Brian Wilson wrote right after JFK was shot.
Yeah.
And I always just thought, I was like, God, what a beautiful song that he wrote, like, in such a sad time. And I'm just like, so the first verse, if you listen to it, it's Fire from the Sky. It was like, that's about the shooting. And then there's a couple lines in there about Tom Petty in that, like, ambiguous, like, nobody would ever know. I use his Traveling Wilburys alias. Charlie T. Wilbury is what he goes, I saw Charlie T. just a week and a half before. I saw him at the Hollywood Bowl literally a week and a half before he died. So without getting too literal on the rest of the lyrics, but that first verse right there was about.
That's so cool. All right. Well, again, man, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about all this. I had a great time talking to you about it.
Yeah, same.
For me, like, having context on music is what it's about for me. I can listen to something real flatly and appreciate it, but the more I understand about where it's coming from, the more it gets me. So
awesome. Well, thanks. I mean, thanks for digging into it. I mean, just even when I saw the first video that popped up, I was like, oh, this is awesome. Like, this guy really really gets it. Like, it's really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, you're welcome, man. And I'd like to thank Timmy Sean again for hanging out with me and taking the time to talk a little bit about this album. And I'd like to thank all of you for hanging out and watching, and I really hope that you enjoyed it. Last year when the pandemic hit, I remember saying something to the effect of we really needed to support artists during this time because, of course, their livelihoods are at stake, but also they give us the ability to look at things with some perspective, and they give us the tools to sometimes deal with these kinds of ordeals. And I think A Tale from the Other Side is a really great example of how you can use music to confront and deal with trauma by looking at it with kind of compassion and beauty rather than fear. So it's an album I really think is super important in perspective of last year, and I can't suggest it highly enough. Anyway, but that's all I got on it this week. So if you like this video, please like it and subscribe and share it out with your friends. Of course, follow me over on Spotify. I'll be putting a track up from Tale from the Other Side in my 2021 playlist. Next week, I'll be coming at you guys with an April roundup. So until then, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.